Hello colleagues, and welcome back to this channel if you're a subscriber. If you're new here, then I'm very happy to see you and very glad that you've joined us for this particular session, this video today. My name is Joe Strahl, and thus far I am the only one who's producing content for and uploading this to this channel. It has to do in this channel with hybrid forms of higher education that we could be working with during the COVID-19 pandemic, but equally as important as we're preparing us for what the new normal will be after the pandemic is over, or over enough that we can return to something which seems more normal. The topic for this video today is pre-recorded lectures, or in general, pre-recorded content. I will use these terms interchangeably. I'll often use lectures instead. In this video, I will be speaking about the pros and the cons, the advantages and the disadvantages of doing pre-recorded lectures. I will also be talking about what I believe are some of the, should we call it, prerequisites to be able to produce high quality, or at least good enough quality, pre-recorded content. I would suggest that pre-recorded lectures are something which should be included more in a hybrid between entirely on-campus teaching and entirely digital teaching. I find, as some of you know, that we've sort of gotten stuck on maybe using Zoom in some ways that maybe we don't need to use it always. We could instead have Zoom as one of several different possible digital options for our teaching and for our students' learning. So pre-recorded lectures, pre-recorded content could be one of many different tools that would be used in a strategy that we could call a hybrid higher education. Now, before we go any further, I have to say that I've noticed something about YouTube and the videos which I have uploaded recently. My videos are always shot in 1080p, as you have heard in a previous lecture. Either in 50 frames per second or 60 frames per second, the number of images that the camera produces each second. I see that on my laptop, when I'm looking at YouTube and when I am looking at the YouTube content that I have uploaded, that it's not in 1080p by default. Instead, it is at 720p, so the quality is poor. You can go in and you can make changes in YouTube on your laptop or on your computer so that you can see the content in the original format at 1080p. It's the same thing with if you're looking at YouTube using your smartphone. God forbid, if you were doing that, when you have a 5 to 6 inch screen, such a small screen, and somebody has put a lot of effort into making quality output, and it's hard to see that kind of quality in the screen. Anyway, I've seen that when using one of my cell phones, one of my smartphones, that not only was it only at 720p on the laptop, it was actually lower quality was set for that. So you can also go into the menu in YouTube, the YouTube video you're looking at, and make changes to 1080p for that viewing a possibility as well. So if we're using a smartphone to look at YouTube, in this case part of this channel, this is maybe part of it what it might look like. And I have put a circle in the upper right-hand corner in red around the 3 dots, and that's where you click, and there is the opportunity in a sort of a drop-down menu to make sort of changes in the setting, and you can increase the video quality in terms of the image quality there. When it comes to watching YouTube on a computer, a laptop or so, it might look more like this. And in the lower right-hand corner, we have this sort of a flower or a gear or whatever we want to think of it is. It's sort of where we change the settings. In this case, we can see there's a small red box where it says HD in it. So we already know that it's at high definition or 1080p video. So if you are a subscriber to this channel, this might be the reason why
you might not have seen much difference in my tests of camera and microphone gear in the third video, because YouTube might not, the YouTube settings that you have on your devices, or YouTube itself might, for some reason, in its infinite wisdom in its algorithms, have decided not to let you see automatically the high definition recordings that have been uploaded.
So now I've showed you, demonstrated with 2 screenshots so we can see what I'm talking about, making those changes. And if you're a subscriber, you might have thought that, well, that quality isn't all that great. And then, of course, you could make those changes so that you could actually see the original content. If you continue as a subscriber of the channel, then perhaps you might want to make it a habit of making sure that the playback on your laptop, or if you use it, your smartphone, is actually at 1080p, and that you are getting the quality that was intended when the production was made. But now let's start with the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages of using pre-recorded educational content. And for this, I'm going to sort of disappear slightly for a while, and I'm going to use PowerPoint and narrate that.
So clearly there are some advantages to pre-recorded content or pre-recorded lectures. I talked about in one of my previous videos on this channel about the idea of a keyhole, that we want to try to make the keyhole wider. The experience, the engagement sort of shoves its way through the internet bandwidth that we have available for us. And if we have pre-recorded content where we are using sufficiently high quality equipment, we have the potential to have higher audio quality, we have the potential to have higher visual quality. Instead of, as in Zoom, we have this incredibly small thumbnail picture of the instructor desperately trying to move hands around while seating and so forth, that the students don't see that because of our PowerPoint being so large on the screen. But here we will be able to have the instructor larger as part of the screen, more of the instructor can be seen, and body language can be used, and there can be more engagement. I think there's going to be an advantage of not having the student and the instructor in the same place and at the same time. Obviously, with the pre-recorded content, the instructor and the student are in different locations. We're not on campus, and that we're in the same room. But here, we're also not in the same time. The advantage, of course, with Zoom is that we are with the students at the same time, but we are there at a distance. The question, of course, is the issues of audiovisual quality and the body language. So students would be able to, with pre-recorded lections where there's this sort of asynchronous kind of connection, the students can watch. They can also do other things that might be part of this, like solve challenges or work with questions that come up during the lecture or content. The students can watch this also when it suits them. Some students might have an opportunity early in the morning, in the middle of the day, early in the evening, and that would mean that it sort of frees them up from having to watch the lecture at 8 o'clock in the morning on Zoom, when that might not be so suitable for them. Obviously, there might be circumstances where we want the students to be all together at the same time with the instructor, and that would be an example that we could use Zoom. Students can also decide whether they want to go back and maybe listen to the second half of a lecture again to make sure they got everything, or, oh, okay, I really think I should probably listen to that one again. This is clearly a great advantage with pre-recorded lectures that are done digitally, as opposed to having a lecture in a classroom. The student may have listened to the lecture, taken some notes, thought that she or he understood everything, and then a few days later realizes that I didn't quite understand that, and then has to wait a few days to see the instructor again and ask a question. In this case, it's always possible to go back and look at the content anytime he wants to. Students can also form groups, discuss one or more lectures, however they want to do that. Other advantages. After the students have watched a pre-recorded lecture, or maybe 2, or maybe 3, or worked with questions which are posed and so forth, then it would make sense that the instructor holds a question and answer session. most likely on Zoom. And the questions that the students have as they've been watching the lectures can be taken up. And it might also be a much more qualitative, in terms of good quality question and answer, where the lecturer can say, oh, but I answered that in this lecture, or that's true, but on the other hand, if we consider this, and so forth. It also would mean a way for a student to be able to say, but professor, in your second lecture, you said this, but I think you contradict yourself in your third lecture. And then either the professor did or the student misunderstood. And this also makes it easier for the instructor to make some sort of linkage between the lectures or whatever it would be. And this makes the session with the question and answers based on the lectures that the students have watched into something which has some sort of similarities to a flipped classroom. It's not the same, but there are some similarities. An advantage could also be for the instructor that there's some sort of a time savings. And I'm writing a question mark here. If I have pre-recorded several lectures during an academic year, even if it's like one every other month, maybe, then those lectures that I have made and the students have had access to during that academic year, I could use it again if it's appropriate. If the content of the lectures and the latest understanding in this particular subject area have not diverged, this could be used, say, 3 more times. That would mean that instead of having the time in the classroom and the preparing for the lecture, I've already done all that work. So that could be seen as a time savings. Finally, we have the idea of taking the pre-recorded content that we have in one course, and this could be borrowed into another course. It would be possible in a completely different program to perhaps have a lecture that was pre-recorded by someone else, and this pre-recorded lecture becomes sort of like a semi-permanent digital guest lecture. And this could either become an integral part of the course, or it could be what we could refer to as supplementary materials. Just like we have in a course syllabus, we have the literature, some of which could be obligatory and some of which could be supplemental.
So looking back at the PowerPoint slide, thinking about what I talked about, we can see that there are a number of advantages with pre-recorded lectures. Of course, there are disadvantages, which I'll be getting to in a moment. I particularly like the idea of being able to borrow a colleague's pre-recorded content in one particular course and add that in as almost like supplementary readings to students in my course. It isn't necessarily maybe to pass the exam, or maybe it is not as a supplementary reading. That would mean that we would have some sort of more collaboration with colleagues. And by recording one particular semi-permanent digital guest lecture that I do or a colleague does, then this might be able to be used over and over again each term, each semester for, say, 3 years before it will be needed to make a new version of that as there has been new research, new findings, or that there has been some sort of update that makes parts of that lecture no longer valid or correct anymore.
Clearly, there are some disadvantages of pre-recorded content or pre-recorded lectures, or potential disadvantages. If I have, as a member of faculty or even a part-time instructor, if I have never done any pre-recorded lectures before, this means that I might have to take some time to learn new skills. My university or parts of the university might not be giving me sufficient time or support for this. I'm in the middle of the pandemic. This is one more thing I have to do. It seems like a lot of stress. It's taking a lot of time from things that have to be done right now, and I feel like I don't have time to do this. That clearly is, for some people, a disadvantage. I said under advantages that there was an advantage that it was asynchronous instruction, but this is also a disadvantage in some ways. Because our lecture is not live, students can't ask us questions during the lecture in the way that could be done if we were on campus and we saw the students in real life, or on Zoom where somebody wants to sort of wave their hand or type something in the chat, and the instructor notices that and then answers the question. On the other hand, if we think about this in a very sort of serious but also broader kind of way, we already know that a lot of student learning is not in conjunction with the instructor and the instructor's availability. If we have a student that's sitting at home reading a particular chapter in a book, well, the instructor is not available at that period of time. The student won't be able to ask the instructor a question about, hello there, professor, on page 153, 154, the book said this, but I don't quite get this, or whatever the student says. And the student says that the next time that there's a meeting on campus. Also, if we recall that there has been, for quite some time, what we could consider more traditional distance learning that has taken place. And there have been specific courses where there have been students that never come to the campus, or that they perhaps come to the campus at the beginning of the term and they come to the campus at the end of the term. They have some sort of project they do. They hear a number of lectures. They read in books. They get tasks to do certain things, and so forth. So having pre-recorded lectures in many ways is nothing new. That has been sort of a staple of certain kinds of teaching and learning in the past. It's just now becoming something that might be more mainstream, so to speak. Finally, a disadvantage, of course, is that it is a sort of a time-consuming activity. There is, as economists speak of, as an opportunity cost. If we invest time right now making the content, this means that if we can reuse this, we're saving. In the long term, we are saving time. But in the short term, we have these particular demands here and now. And the opportunity which is presenting itself may seem too costly for us now, that it causes too much of a problem. It's not worth it. So clearly, there are some disadvantages.
Yeah, there might be more negatives, but it's really hard for me to figure out what those would be. There are disadvantages. There is some sort of upfront investment in learning how to do things, as I'm doing now with the camera and so forth. But on the other hand, if you follow some of the videos in this channel, then maybe it'll be easier to make that kind of investment in time. And the dividend from your investment, what you get in return, is that in the future, next term, next semester, next year, that you've already done a small amount of the work that was required then, but you did that already now. And then after a few years of using that, then it's time to update it again, just like we would update any particular lecture after a few years. However, your perspective may vary about this. You may think that actually it's a bad idea to do this. While the number of positives, the pros, the advantages are greater than the disadvantages, maybe the numbers comparing, say, 5 to 3 isn't quite fair, that some of them are heavier than others. You could provide comments about that. Not too negative comments, constructive criticism comments down below in this video. And I will see if I can get to see that. I also can say that I do know at least one colleague who's been pre-recording lectures prior to COVID-19. And I'm sure that you know some colleague someplace who has been doing the same thing. We have colleagues that, including ourselves, if we have colleagues that we know that occasionally have a very heavy workload. And it could be an advantage when you have somewhat less of a workload to make 2, 3, 4 pre-recorded lectures that would otherwise be in class or Zoom-based lectures if it is now. And you've done that now, say in the month of November, for a class that will be held in, or lectures that would otherwise be held, or educational activities in February. And so you've done some of that work when you had a week when there wasn't quite as much to do, perhaps. And then that really difficult week, or 2 weeks, or 3 weeks in February, just as an example, then your workload then is slightly less. So it could be to advantage if you're able to plan that, and if you have the amount of time. It's a rather clever pre-COVID-19 kind of idea and practice that some people have been just doing a little bit all along anyway. So let's go to the prerequisites. What has to be in place for quality pre-recorded lectures and other forms of educational content to be in place and to be supported? If we're actually going to widen the keyhole, like I talked about in a previous lecture. And it isn't a question about the academic content, say the empirical materials and studies, the theories, the concepts, the methods, that kind of content in the educational activity or the lecture, the seminar, the exercise, or whatever that will be conducted. It's a question about quality in, shall we say, the delivery or the interaction. And if we're going to do that, and pre-recorded lectures will be part of that, we also have to have a certain level of quality when it comes to our technical infrastructure and the technical equipment or gear that employees, faculty, and so forth have, or at the very least have access to too. And when coming to the idea of access or actually having, I teach environmental studies, and so it's very obvious for me to think about reducing environmental impacts and sustainability and so forth. So I'm very open to the idea and think it's positive with sharing equipment, sharing gear, and of course we would be sharing experiences as well. And that could mean that, say, a group of 5 or 6 faculty perhaps would be sharing certain equipment, and that they would take turns, that somebody would use it mostly one week and somebody would use it mostly another week. But during the period of time when we have COVID-19, and most of us, most of the time, are working from home, it's a bit of a problem. That would mean that people who, for health reasons, might want to avoid actually being in the workplace, going there and then leaving the equipment, and then meeting up with the person who is going to take the equipment, and that person might also have some sort of health issues and really needs to avoid getting infected because of the risk of having some sort of long COVID-19 or underlying health issues. So sharing equipment during a pandemic seems to be rather difficult. It might not work very well. In varying degrees, universities around the world have tried to support their employees when they are working from home. I have a much larger screen than the one on my laptop that I can connect to, that I can use to be able to have a better experience when I'm on Zoom, or that if I'm editing something and the laptop screen seems very small, I have a number of things like that. On the other hand, I personally have bought certain things out of my own pocket to make things easier for me to do what I felt was necessary for teaching digitally, over and above which kinds of equipment that many of my colleagues might have in the university. So, many of us have received information about ergonomics at home. We've been reminded to take pauses instead of just keep working and so forth. We have maybe can borrow long-term loans, certain technical equipment and so forth. And this, of course, it's very commendable. We've heard workshops about certain things, and we could attend digitally some sort of recommendations and so forth. Again, very commendable. And for some people, this is exactly what they think they want, and it's exactly what they think they need. Another thing to consider is that not everyone can very easily work from home. This has been talked about in various kinds of forums within universities, between university instructors and various universities and so forth. So what might there be for reasons that you wouldn't be able to work from home? One, there just might not be enough space. You live in the center of the city, your apartment is small, there's no room in the living room or the kitchen, there's no extra work, etc., or it would be very difficult. Or you don't live alone, you have a partner, and this person is also working from home, and there's not really room for both people to be there. That's possible. Or there might be space that's available, but it's only temporarily available, and there's some sort of contested space in the apartment or in the house where you can't use that space all the time, 24 hours, and leave things there. There's no possibility of a dedicated home office, even if it's a small room or, say, the size of a closet. Another possibility is that there's a family member who's sick, could be COVID-19, could be something else, or whatever reason, and this person has to be isolated. So the space that was perhaps a guest bedroom or was a home office, but now has to temporarily become a sort of an isolated room for that particular person who's there most of the time, it's no longer possible. And for some people, this could be actually months of time where prior to the pandemic there was room, and now when I have to be home, there is no room. Or you might have smaller or maybe not so small children at home, and that they may be taking space and place mentally or physically in such a way that it just becomes very difficult to work from home, and you would prefer to work from your normal workplace. And you're hoping that there aren't very many people that are there when you're there, so that you might be able to do that. And it's one thing, of course, to support employees in various ways that they can establish some sort of a home office. But what I am alluding to is that there might be a need on the part of some faculty to actually have something which we could call a home office plus. It would involve the possibility of setting up what we could call a home studio. So I'm standing in this rather crowded room, and I have a plan to make changes in the room so that part of it will be an office and part of it will be a studio. But that's going to take a while to be able to get that there. So, if we have a number of faculty members who are unable to work from home, and if a university is unwilling to encourage and support certain faculty members to be able to work from home entirely with some sort of a home studio, shall we call it, then the next question is, what should the university perhaps be doing? And now I'm being very normative. So what might that be? I would like to suggest that it is to the advantage of a number of universities around the world if the new normal is going to be that we don't have quite as many students and quite as many academic and administrative staff on campus as we have had in the past, because there will be a certain component of distance learning, that we might have in some places almost a surplus of space. There might be some small seminar rooms that could be turned into, they could be repurposed into semi-professional studios. That way, people who could not work from home to make a recording could go to work and do that. It would be interesting if people wrote on the comments below if there are examples of that taking place in your university. Some universities may be doing this, others may not even have considered doing this time, particularly if there's been not much interest in pre-recorded lectures or much emphasis with regard to that. I would think that a room or rooms like that should be able to be booked by not only, of course, the academic staff in the university. There could be a need on the part of administrative staff to make a pre-recorded lecture to describe using a particular kind of software, for example, or certain kinds of routines. So this should not just be limited to the academic staff, of course. And these kinds of rooms should be able to be booked, maybe a whole morning, 8 to 12, say, or a whole afternoon, or potentially an evening, and one, possibly two employees of the university go into the room, and things are already there. There are lights hanging from the ceiling. There would be a whiteboard, maybe on one wall. There would be a projector screen on another wall with a projector. There would be a camera, perhaps mounted in the ceiling, which could be moved around. There would be several microphones, perhaps. There might be a small table in the corner if you wanted to sit and interview somebody as part of an instructional, educational interview. All kinds of things like that. And the room would have some sort of sign, like old-time radio. It would say on air, so nobody would go into the room and bother what was going on there, so the recording could take place. This would mean that an individual instructor maybe could easily spend 2 or 3 hours in a leisurely pace without any stress and pre-record entire educational content or parts of that. And I'm saying perhaps there could be 2 or 3 people, because you might have one person doing the technical parts and the other one who's functioning as the lecturer, so to speak, for a while, and then those people switch places. That would seem to be a great advantage there. And these rooms could be, there would be a number of them in several different buildings, and it would be an alternative for people who cannot do that at home. Now, when we think about these rooms, something that concerns me, of course, and I was describing something which sounded like a studio, that once upon a time, when we go back into the past, at least in universities that I have worked in, there would be, shall we call them, PowerPoint projectors in the large lecture halls where you could have hundreds of students, and one or two or so would be mounted in the ceiling someplace. And you would take your computer, or you would connect to the intranet, and you would get the PowerPoint file that you wanted to use, and you would use that. But if you were going to be only lecturing, say, to 40 students, then you had to go someplace and get a cart that had a projector on it, wheel the cart, and this had to be booked ahead of time, wheel it some distance, set it up at the right distance in the room, connect it to the computer, and so forth like that, and then start the lecture. That would all be very time consuming. It would be great, wouldn't it, that we didn't take that route with having to go someplace and have a box of technical equipment and have to take that to the room and to mount certain things into the ceiling all by ourselves, and to pull the cables and so forth. And then when that half hour of time is gone and we start on this, we realize that, oh, there are no batteries in such and such or something like that. So there's a lot of lost time. So hopefully we won't have universities that will sort of go through this sort of temporary step, that they will actually go towards having much more dedicated rooms with the equipment already set up, or at the very least locked someplace in the room that the employee can then take things out, the lecture, and then mount it up, instead of having to go maybe even to another building and get the cart and use that. That's my 2 cents, my nickel, or my, I don't know, 50 euro cents or something like that about this issue. And I can see that that kind of thing might be an issue in the future. So if you thought that was an interesting idea, a good idea, you could write something about it in the comments. If you think, oh, well, our university is already preparing for that, excellent. It would be good to hear about that, so that those who would be subscribers to the channel could know that, and they could make arguments in their own university. Well, University A and B are doing this. Why aren't we doing this? And so forth. Thank you for listening and watching today. I deliberately contrasted between being very visible and engaging in this video in some parts, and in other parts where I was not really seen, but instead I sort of hid behind a PowerPoint presentation where I narrated what we were looking at. Besides the obvious content, you might also want to reflect upon any differences that you could see in the parts where I was visible and engaged, and other parts where I was just a narrator, an unseen narrator in the background. Or perhaps you didn't notice this at all, or you didn't see that as being poor quality, perhaps in part because it was relatively short. Again, thanks for listening and watching. In my next video, I'm going to show you a, shall we call it, a setup that I sometimes use in my living room for pre-recording lectures, and I will be more of a show and tell or demonstration type of video. Until next time, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next video on this channel. Goodbye.